All right, we're in Philippians chapter 4. And if anybody needs a handout, I got a few extra. We are closing in on the end of the letter to the Philippians. It's hard to get away from it, though, because these last couple chapters are full of a lot of hints, tidbits that Paul has for getting along in a pagan culture and trying to make Christianity attractive. And that's hard to do. That's very hard to do. But one of the things he says here, we'll get there in just a few minutes, but he says, let's have this attitude because the Lord is near. Yeah, I need thee every hour. There was a teacher I had in school, grade school, that was from some Christian group. I don't remember what it was, but his paddle on the wall had that engraved on it. I need thee every hour. So I grew up with a different view of what that phraseology meant. But come quickly and abide, or life is vain. You can see a principal at school might think that way. But, if temptations lose their power when thou art nigh. How many sins would we get into if we realize that every moment of every day, God is with us at every place and everywhere we go? He knows our thoughts and our intentions, the writer of Hebrews says. That's scary. How much trouble would we get into if we knew that? Well, there was one kid in one of the youth group, and he had a very mature view of his temptations. He says, but I don't want to drag Jesus through that. And I thought, that's what a mind to have. That's what we need to grow into. And I think that's what
people that go around shooting people to think that.
Well, think of Saul of Tarsus. Thought he was doing God's will by going out and killing people who had a different view, a religious view. And thinking that God was pleased with that. And we have people that cause divisions within our ranks and think they're standing for the truth and pointing out error. The thing is, as Paul says in the Ephesian letter, our enemy is not flesh and blood. Okay? Other people are not our enemy. He even says in another place, he says, we take thoughts captive and we segregate them from our lives. And that's how we have to look at things. And Philippians 4, there are two ladies who are fighting, Euodia and Syntyche. And he calls on the congregation, especially those in leadership positions that have worked side by side with him throughout the work of the church there, to help these two not come to an agreement, but to be okay with doing things differently. We think there's only one way to do everything right, and that's just not the case, is it? You look at Romans, and Paul lists the different gifts that people have. That's a great study anyway, the different gifts. And he lists just a few, but it's a showcase of just about everybody in the congregation. You have teachers. If a man's gift is teaching, let him teach. Don't hold him back. If a man's gift is leadership, let him lead. If it's encouraging, you don't know how important it is to a congregation to have encouragers. Especially in our day and time when everyone wants to argue about everything. You need the encouragers. You need the Barnabases. If it's this gift, let him do it. And the whole idea is stand back and let God work through them. God has gifted all of us in a different way. I may preach at times, but I think some of you have had enough of an example to see that my sermons are basically Bible lessons, aren't they? Like Bible class. That's my gift. And so I'll do these others. I'll encourage people through a Bible study. I'll do a leadership class through a Bible study. We have our main gift that God has given us. We'll do these other things that are necessary through that one gift. I knew a guy who was a preacher, could not teach a Bible class for anything. because he couldn't get to the point. He was just too spread out. And here with preaching, what's required, the difference between preaching and teaching, the way we do it. In the first century, preaching was basically a Bible class. That's why Paul could preach until midnight. The actual word there is dialogue. It's not kerux, which is a lecture, where everyone sits quietly and listens to a guy argue a point from the most minor context to the most major one and come to a conclusion and then expect a response. That's what our preaching is. And most of us cannot sit more than a half hour through that, can we? I tend to teach a Bible class through that time period, and it frustrates a lot of people. But that's my gift. Once we know our gift, we use it, we're happy. If people force you into doing something that you're not gifted for, those people don't stay long, do they? No.
In the first century, we talked about together to go on the first day of the week and breaking of bread, which we assume is also communion. Because breaking bread is a lot of things, right?
Breaking of bread just means sharing a meal.
Okay, that's what I thought. But
And now in Acts chapter 2, it says they met daily to break bread in each other's houses. And people will say, well, you can't do that. You can only do that on Sunday. But Jesus said, as often as you do it. He didn't say how often.
these are not a worship service as we recognize today, correct?
Probably not, no. Actually, when they met together to have meals together, it was because they were practically destitute, especially the Jewish Christians who were kicked out of the synagogue.
Okay.
Also, they were blacklisted, if you can use that term. They were pariahs in society, and people would have nothing to do with them. Wouldn't buy their goods. Well, if you can't sell, you don't make money, you can't eat. They would not sell their stuff to them. They would not take their money, as if money was had the person's, the owner's DNA on it. They wouldn't take, your money's not good here, basically. So they would have to pretty much travel to other areas where they weren't necessarily known, or they would go to Greek areas like Galilee and up into Macedonia, even as far as Italy and Rome, just so they could carry on business and make money for their family. And so if they were around Judea and they were outcasts, sometimes the only food they had, it was to share it like today we do after service. And that, you got to eat every day to stay healthy. And so they would meet daily, house to house. It doesn't mean it was a organized worship assembly, but when they would meet together, part of their meal, Jude and Peter both call it a love feast, because part of their meals together were a remembrance of Jesus, his body and his life as the blood. And so they would partake. Early Christian writers do talk about that, them doing that on a daily basis, because they had to. They were destitute. They had nothing else. Later on, after Christianity became legalized in the Roman culture, and they built buildings for the purpose of worship assemblies, then it became where they would come from all quarters to a specific meeting at a specific time. But when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper on the night he was betrayed, he says, as often as you do this, you remember, you proclaim my death. And not just the death, because how did it really end up? 3 days later, empty tomb. He's alive. And so it was a celebration. It was not a doldrum. It was not a come and feel guilty for what you made Jesus go through. It was not a sit and think about it. It was actually a celebration. Victory over Satan and sin. Satan does such a good job. to get us out of that mindset. And we tend to put people down who try to be a little bit more than exuberant in worship assemblies. They're really feeling the salvation, and we're trying to calm them down. And that's, I guess, the British in us. But their assemblies, we would probably think, were a little bit out of the ordinary and raucous occasions sometimes. How they would celebrate. Yeah, we wouldn't allow that in a lot of our congregations today. Paul would probably come in and sit among us and say, you know what, you need to breathe some life into you people. And that's what he tells them in Corinth. They got out of hand. You know, some were leaving drunk. And that, in Ephesians, you look at that, and that was the occasion there in Ephesus where they would get drunk to lessen their inhibitions and their pagan worships. And Paul says, no, instead of being filled with wine, be filled with the Spirit. So that sense of victory and confidence. Yeah. That's another study all in and of itself, and it's a very interesting one. It's one I had to delve into with my master's thesis, which was on the concept of worship. Because Eldred Eccles would tell me when he was in Africa, that was his number one claim to the proof of the existence of God, is that no matter where he went, the most remotest areas, those people would worship a higher being. And he had a basis to stand on now to preach the gospel everywhere he went. He could tell them, like Paul did in Athens, about the God they didn't know anything about. They had that statue to the one they may have forgotten. Yeah, it's the unknown God. Let me tell you about the one you don't know about. Yeah, very successful. And it's just built into us to worship God. It's just part of our DNA, our nature. You have to physically, purposefully repress it. Paul says in Romans chapter 1, they repress that just so they can do what they want. And our culture today has become very repressive, hasn't it? We're going to the polls on Tuesday, and there are some issues there that are trying to get us to repress what we know is right. Anyway, here's Paul in his latest expectations. Let's quit the arguing. And a lot of people, I'm convinced, a lot of people think the Bible was written so that we would have proof texts to argue over with each other. It's just, that scripture was because it means this. And yeah, if you think they're off base, you're going to jump in, aren't you? And there you go. There goes the argument. Satan wins again. Yeah, actually, the scripture, that was the Pharisees' problem too. They thought the scriptures said something about everything that could possibly happen in life. And Jesus had to direct them back to the truth. He said, no, they're the scriptures that talk about me. Yet you refuse to come to me to have the life you're looking for. I'm the only one that can provide it. I'm the way, the truth, and the life, he told his disciples. No one can come to the Father except through me. That's what the scriptures are all about. And what we call New Testament now is no different. It's not a science textbook. We try to use it for that, we're going to be in arguments, aren't we? It's not a manifesto on how to run a government, is it? No. What the Bible is for, from Genesis 3 to the end of Revelation, is how to get your sins redeemed through the blood of Christ. And then hang on until he comes back. And that's how Paul ends all of his letters, but especially this one in Philippi. And if we're arguing like these two ladies, and you gotta know the congregation was siding with one or two or both of them, right? They were picking their battles. They were lining up. They were defending what they thought was right. And, let's work this out. We'll do it this way. And, just give in, and just, no. We're all going to do it in a different way, but we're all doing it right. There isn't just one right way to do everything. And all we have to do is be in Christ, hang on until he comes again, because he's the judge, not us. Wanting to be a disciple of Jesus is a voluntary decision. You don't have to be a disciple of Jesus.
But as Christian people, don't we need to conduct ourselves in a manner of fashion?
Mm-hmm. But how do we usually show it?
Kindness?
They'll know we are Christians because of the love you have for one another. And love is not easy. Love is probably the most difficult thing you can do. That's why Jesus had one command for his disciples, just one.
Yeah, but you,
Love one another how?
As I have loved
The way I have loved you, because it's not going to be easy. And they were arguing about who was the greatest at that meal.
but you know, you see so many people that claim to be Christians that if you look at them, they don't look Christian.
Mm-mm. Yeah, and there are some people in the churches where I've been, I don't want them to tell people where they go, where they attend worship. I didn't want that. But see, I'm not the final judge of that. And you never know when they're going to turn, when something in their life is going to spark it. And you have to make sure they feel welcome coming back to you. In Corinth, Paul talks about a man who had his father's wife. Okay, he didn't say he had his mother. Had his father's wife, so his father probably remarried. And I don't know if he died or not, but it was a scandal in the city of Corinth, which you had to be pretty low and dirty for the Corinthians to think anything was a scandal. And he said, don't have him in your assemblies. Well, 2 Corinthians, you get the impression he's talking about that situation. They're asking Paul, what should we do with this guy? Because he's come back and he's repented. What should we do? Paul said, well, you forgive him. And you let him come back in. Because that's what God does. And that's what we have to look at. And yeah, okay, he's bringing that baggage in too. And other people in the community say, he worships with you. God says, I'm going to treat you people right so that the pagans will glorify me. Think of what that means. If God can forgive them, I have a chance. Nothing is too bad for God to forgive.
We do want a weekly thing, everything. Steve, stand up for the congregation. We got your videotape of everything you did this week, good and bad. I don't think any of us would want that.
Could I edit it?
We're not like the Jews, when we check off, well, I did this, I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken out of the scriptures, him that doeth to do good and doeth it not, to him in a sin.
Mm-hmm.
Or another translation I saw, everybody's guilty of the good they didn't do. I cannot swear, I cannot listen to dirty jokes, I cannot be mad at somebody.
Mm-hmm.
If there's people in need and I fail to act, or people, need to bring up God in a conversation when I should, and don't, I'm just as bad as...
And this is where sometimes we have overstepped our boundaries too, is because God is the final judge,
Amen.
not us. And we can point out how people should have done it better. But it's actually, if they're not convinced of it, if God has not convinced them of that through their faith, nothing's changed. They're no better off. Even if they come and don't say anything. Even if they show up, and that has happened many times in the congregation where they get into some sin, some crime in the community, and they come into the worship and they won't let them do anything where they can be seen. You sit in the back. Basically, one guy was told, sit in the back. I had to gather the guys together again and say, we can't do that. We have to make them feel comfortable, because then if people see that we accept that, they feel they have a chance. Others are going to point the finger and say, see, they're not a true church then, because they accept these people. Okay, who's the judge? God is the judge.
Paul deals with the concept of weaker and stronger faith between members at points. And nobody wants to admit that they have a weaker faith.
Oh, no.
But sometimes and the concept he uses, if somebody comes in and has got a problem, who has a weaker faith in you, a less of an understanding of God, then just give in to him. What difference does it make? 50 years ago, had a young guy that was supposed to lead singing, and he didn't show up. So they asked brother sons, "Would you lead singing?" And yeah, I get up. Well, about halfway through the service, and the young guy showed up, and he came up and he stood right where you're at, staring at the pulpit. Just stood there staring at the guy. "You're doing my job." You know, he got down and left. Let the young guy get up there. But,
Yeah.
I mean, it's an obvious choice that, most of us who are mature enough to say, well, yeah, they got a handle on to sit down, He wasn't strong enough in his faith to do that. So the person leading singing got down.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the kind of problems that we have in churches. It's not necessarily somebody's a murderer or, a thief or something like that comes in.
Yeah. Yeah. And who knows what these ladies were arguing over, but Paul had to remind them, let's get them to work together because their names are written in the book of life. Okay? God does not kick people out and then bring them back later and then kick them out again when they mess up and then bring them back when they say I'm sorry and then kick them out again when you're either in or you're not. And God's looking at the whole life, not the final act, not the final thoughts. He's looking at the whole life. And if it's on an upward projected, if it looks at him, one example for me has always been that of Samson, the judge, Samson. I can't stand that he's listed in Hebrews 11. He has no business being there.
No morals.
But I'm not the judge. And actually, when I calm down and my temper is under control again, I start to think, what amazing grace God has. Because I have been in congregations where one guy did admit, because he was angry enough, he didn't want a certain person leading singing. He says, I'm the weaker Christian, you have to give in to me. And that is a quote, direct verbatim quote.
Wow.
Okay. That's what Paul is saying we can't have any of. Because of what goes on here. Verse 4. He says, rejoice in the Lord. How often? All the time? Really, a flat tire on the road? Yippee! Right? Now, the idea of rejoice is that you're good with whatever happens. You can get through this. Yeah. A little later on, he's going to say, I can do everything. Well, no, he didn't say I can do everything. He said, I can do whatever I have to handle because God gives me the strength to do it. So we rejoice in the Lord. That is a present tense. That's why the always is there. We're going to rejoice in the Lord. Where is Paul when he wrote that? If he's dictating it, you think the guy writing that out is listening to what he says, rejoice in the Lord always.
Yeah.
He has to just emphasize it again. Again, I'm going to say this, and now he writes it in the future tense. I'll say it again, rejoice. He said, this is not the only time I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it till the day I die. Because that's the only thing that gets you through it.
This is a general concept of life.
Mm-hmm.
In general, you're going to be rejoicing. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be times that you're going to say, man, why'd that happen? Look at Paul. What's he? I ain't having Mark here. No, he's not coming,
Yeah.
And yet, he's rejoicing about everything, right?
Yeah.
So it's more of a general attitude towards life. That you're going to find joy in life. It doesn't mean you're not going to get angry, you're not going to have disappointments and those things. But, you don't let that control you.
Right. Right. And, what's that say about people who say you're not, religion is not supposed to be enjoyable? It's a sacrifice, I was told. You don't enjoy that. That's why we sing such somber and sullen songs. We can't sing a lively one. We can't be entertained. Read the psalm where David says, I rejoiced. And that word is celebrated when the men came to me and said, let's go to the house of the Lord. He'd gotten caught up so much in the business of running the government. He'd gotten so caught up, and they said, let's take a break. Let's go to the house of the Lord. Yeah. Now, did God create this universe and then expect us to hate it? Just bide our time until he finally shows up? No. And that I have to check myself when it comes time for Lord's Supper too. Yeah, am I feeling guilty? I am guilty, but not anymore. Jesus has taken away my guilt. He's redeemed me from the grave. It really was, in the first century, it was a love feast, a celebration. The sacrifices under the old covenant, the opening covenant, they always ended, except for a few where the whole animal was burnt. The rest of the animal was given to the one sacrificing, to the one going through the worship, to sit down and have a fellowship meal. They were to celebrate their forgiveness. So Ezra the priest, when he was reading the law to them, and they were crying because they knew they messed up big time. And he said, no, you will not do this. This is a celebration to the Lord. There will be no crying, only joy. The joy of the Lord will be your strength. Now, quit crying and start celebrating. Because he said, God could have wiped us out, but he spared us. He spared the good people. The good people were taken away into exile. The bad people were actually killed in the takeover. And Ezra and then I think it was Ezekiel too, the prophet at the time, and Nehemiah were all sent to them to get them back on track. Yeah. All right. Rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again. Future tense. Rejoice. He said, I'm going to keep saying it. No one's going to shut me up. Not even me. I'm going to keep saying rejoice. And then he says, let your gentleness be evident to all. That word gentleness is translated differently in just about every English translation because there isn't an English word for it. Every language has words that just don't translate. Sometimes you need a whole sentence or a whole phrase. So if you get an amplified Bible, what that is a running commentary. It's not really a translation, but it's an explanation of what is there. We'll have a paragraph or two to explain that one sentence because of that word. No one knows in English the best word to put there. It's the idea of when the woman who was taken in adultery was thrown down at Jesus' feet. So now the law commands us to stone her to death. What do you say? Well, Jesus didn't answer, did he? You don't have to answer every question because every question isn't asked to get an answer. Sometimes they're meant to make you look stupid. That's what they were asking Jesus about. They wanted to see whose side he was on. No matter what he said, they thought they had him trapped. They could condemn him either way.
To see if he'd break the law.
This is okay. Well, now, if all of you have done this exactly right, go ahead and throw the first stone. Because the law that God gave to Moses had a whole bunch of different steps in there that they were conveniently leaving out. One, can you know what one was? Where's?
Witness of more or two or more or something.
3 or more witnesses. They probably had that. But she did not commit adultery by herself. The one, he was probably paid to set it all up. I'm guessing. But Jesus knew they'd skipped a few steps. You want to go by the law? Go by the law. And they all stepped away. Till she was left alone with him. If she was caught in the act, she was probably sitting there naked too. I envision him wrapping a robe around her, saying, "Don't you have any accusers? Where are they?" They're gone. But she's not out of the woods yet, is she? So Jesus says, "Go ahead. I don't condemn you either. Don't sin anymore." I doubt she ever thought about sinning again. But that is the word that's used here in the Greek by Paul. The first time, the only time in his letters that we have in which he used it. That's called a hapax legomena, where he used it only one time in a whole series of letters or books. Shakespeare had a whole bunch of hapax legomena. It was a statement that he only made one time in any of his plays. This is the only time Paul uses this word. And what it means is, you've got the letter of the law and a person is guilty, but for the sake of his soul, you'll let it go. Good examples. 1, David committed adultery with another man's wife. What did the law require?
Death, stoning.
Did God require it? No. Let him go. Not only did he let him go, he allowed him to marry her. Not only did he allow him to marry her, have children with her, and who was the next king? Her son. Matthew, in his genealogy of Jesus, could not even bring himself to say her name. She's an ancestor of Messiah. That is the context of this word that Paul says. Let that be evident in your life. Yeah, you can condemn them. You can prove it. You have a proof text and they are false teachers. But instead, Aquila and Priscilla take Apollos home for a meal. Get into a Bible study. Explain to him more perfectly. And what kind of a preacher was he afterwards? Paul couldn't control him. I was going to send Apollos to you, but he decided to go somewhere else. Paul wasn't used to that, was he? No, Apollos, he was a very forceful preacher. But it was because Aquila and Priscilla had used this word and let that be evident in their life. They could denounce them. They could write them up in the church papers. But this word, let your gentleness be known to all. For the sake of the person and the church, we're going to let God be the judge here. Now, that looks weak, doesn't it? Just like in our politics, you're on one side or the other, two-party system. You can't admit that somebody on the other side has a good idea. You can't do that. It's weak. Okay, that's the word. The Good Samaritan in Jesus' story. That this word describes the Samaritan. And don't you know, when Jesus told that story, those people probably just cringed when the Samaritan was the hero of his story. The priest and the Levite, surely they'll help. Walked on by. Now, they had a rule. Under the law of Moses, and the Pharisees were real good about detailing this one. They could not officiate in the temple if they touched human blood. Now that makes it a little more understandable why they didn't stop and help, right? They help this guy, they're going to be touching a damaged body with an oozing of blood and body fluids and stuff, and now they have to sit in seclusion for 7 days and go through all these ceremonial washings, and then they got to go to a priest and be declared clean, and by that time, it's time to go home. So, and God warned the priests, you will not make yourself unclean for any reason. So knowing that, you can see why they passed by on the other side. And it was a Samaritan. And when Jesus said, now who acted like the neighbor? The guy couldn't even say the Samaritan, could he? I suppose the one who had mercy on him. Right. Now, you be the Samaritan. Oh. Yeah.
I think the biggest thing we fight, even as Christians, if you remember Star Trek and Spock, it's not logical.
No.
And we, David, Bathsheba, talk about Samson, you talk about these other things. It's not logical. Why would he do that?
And I'm glad you bring that up, because that's coming up here, what Paul is saying. It's not humanly reasonable. But that's what makes us different from God. He is not like us. And let's keep that firmly in mind. God is not like us. We think he is. We think he backs up what we feel strongly about. And Saul of Tarsus found out differently, didn't he? Now, he says, the Lord is near. How do you want to be acting when Jesus comes back? You want to be verbally abusing someone? You want to be writing them up in the papers and showing it publicly and what an evil teacher he is? Is that how Jesus acted? But when he says the Lord is near, he's not talking about location, because he is, and we all realize that. His return is imminent. It could be at any moment. And when he returns to take us home, what do you want your last memories to be in this life? Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will be the sentry guard. Paul's in a prison, right? He's got a sentry sitting outside the door, making sure no one brings anything in where he can use to escape, making sure he doesn't get out. A trained killer is what the Roman sentries were. Trained, skilled killers. That's what God's peace is to your soul. The peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will sentry your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Well, knowing that, the bad things that are happening in life, things we got to pay for, and prices going up, really, in the end, that's not all going to matter that much, is it? It matters now. I lay awake at night many nights until I get this understanding again. Well, you know what? He's brought me this far. He'll carry me through. He'll help me out. I really appreciate the transition from Moses to Joshua. Read it in Joshua chapter 1. Those would have been big shoes to fill. God comes down to Joshua, and he was Moses' aide. So he watched and he experienced everything during the Exodus. And God says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Oh. Now you lead these people in. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. Once God said that, Joshua had no problems after that. Let's go! Because he saw how God was with Moses. Man, if I got that kind of power behind me, we're unstoppable. There was only one hitch in the road along the way. Read through the book of Joshua, see if you can find it. God didn't kick him out of the family. He's still in the Lamb's book of life. God gave him a pep talk, and he marched on again. That is what Paul, I think, is trying to get to us. Let's be in that constant connection of prayer. Thankful for whatever comes our way, rejoicing in the Lord always. We're not going to let that get us so mad that we treat other people evilly. We're going to let them get away with murder. Because the true judge, right around the corner, be here any moment.
So you're saying that Joshua made a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
right? But God overlooked it.
He forgave it.
Yeah,
When they lost the battle of Ai,
yeah.
Joshua said, "Oh no, should we go back to Egypt?" Whoa, no.
I thought it was when people came, they set them apart.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, that wasn't Joshua's fault. That's
Joshua,
Joshua and the elders then got together and took counsel, and they took it to the Lord. And the Lord said, "No, you bring them in then." But with Ai, the problem with Ai and why they failed, why they got smeared by a tiny little town, a little village, beat them all up. They did not go under God's direction. They took it upon themselves. And they got smeared. When they then took it to God, they went again and then they conquered it. So, but that's what gets me. There's Joshua, God's man, after Moses. Should we go back to Egypt? No, he already told. How many times did he tell him, "You're not going back there"? But he was so despondent. He thought he had failed. No, God said, "No, we're moving forward. And you're still in charge." That's the God we serve. He lets us get away with murder. All right, I'll probably finish up then next week.